When Rosa Ellis, an elderly caretaker, entered a courtroom in silence with the sole purpose of learning the truth about a strong white judge who had long substituted prejudice for justice. Let's enter this unforgettable tale together. Can one regular lady truly challenge the system designed to stifle voices like hers? What would you do if you knew the truth but everyone else refused to listen? Just starting to spread across the roofs of a little Georgia town, creating long shadows over Main Street's faded awnings and crumbling walkway. The courthouse clock hadn't reached 7 yet, but inside a small motel room. A few blocks away, Rosa Ellis was already wide awake. The room was empty, with a phone held and a folded uniform on a chair, and a single suitcase by the door. Firmly in Rosa's hand, she stood close to the window, gazing out at the stillness. Her face was composed and unreadable, the type of face that had learnt over the years to keep things simple. Yet her eyes were focused and, taking a deep breath, she continued, "Yes, I've read the entire report. The patterns are consistent and the complaints are credible. I'll go in today just as planned. No names, no attention, just observation, a pause then." There was another pause on the line, and her tone changed to one of cool decisiveness. "I'll see it for myself. Today's hearing will tell us everything we need to know about Judge Carter." Heard then nodded slightly, saying, "Don't worry, I've done this before. They won't even notice I'm there." She concluded the call in a low voice, akin to someone shutting a door they didn't intend to open again. Then she turned to the chair. Her uniform was already laid out, plain navy blue with a simple patch sewed on the chest that read Facilities. It was a janitor's uniform, and the kind people walked in it. She had her phone in a small zippered pouch inside her bag. Rosa buttoned the front, smoothed out the sleeves, and put on her black work shoes without giving it a second glance. But the woman putting it on wasn't who she seemed. When she looked in the mirror, she saw strength without loudness, power, or ego, not weakness. She opened her suitcase and took out two things, a worn notebook and Anne. With a silent exhale, she threw her bag over one shoulder and tucked her old ID badge both securely into the inner lining of her bag, hoping she wouldn't need it today. Shoulder took the handle of her mop and left the room. The courthouse was a tall, pale stone structure with columns that resembled ancient bones. It had been there for more than a century, but the tales that went through its walls weren't all. Honorable Rosa walked by the staff door in the back, waving courteously at the security officer who hardly looked up, having studied its history and knowing its secrets better than others. The building smelled of lemon cleaner and paper files, and the floor tiles reverberated beneath her footsteps as she made her way inside. He said, "Good morning, Mike," from his phone, warning Miss Rose. The scene of today's hearing. As her cart slid softly behind her, people were already assembling in courtroom 3B. Lawyers pouring through documents, a concerned young woman in a blazer whispering to a colleague, and a bailiff leaning. The seat where Judge Carter would soon sit felt strange, heavy, as if a storm cloud had formed over it. Rosa, with her arms crossed against the wall, watched everything and nothing but the center of the room. Positioned herself next to a supply closet towards the back of the courtroom, opened her notebook, wrote a brief note, and put it back in her purse. The defendant, a young black male, went unnoticed. Rosa saw him as he sat by alone at the defense table, possibly in his early 20s, hands clasped, gaze fixed on a spot on the floor, and the tension surrounding him seemed to have reached a consensus. When she looked at the bench again, she recognized Judge Carter's posture, which was one of dread but also dignity, as if he was accustomed to battling for space in a world that rarely provided it. History, how he disregarded grievances, and how he made decisions in favor of authority even when the evidence demanded otherwise. She was aware of the statistics, the patterns, and the stories, but they weren't sufficient. Because certain things you have to see for yourself, Rosa was here to see the truth with her own eyes and hear it with her own ears. To everyone else, she was just another cleaner in the courtroom doors creaked open as Judge James Carter entered. But Rosa Ellis was never merely in the background. Instead, she was always watching and waiting, and this time, justice was watching with her. Judge Carter didn't say anything or have. Carter moved slowly and methodically, like a guy would when he feels the world belongs to him. while everyone else in the room stood as though, on cue, the BFF had called out the niceties. His robe flowed behind him like a shadow, and his tall, clean-shaven hair was perfectly parted to the side. Yet it was his appearance, not his appearance, that unnerved people. People in the community believed that James Carter, who had served as a judge in this county for more than 20 years, was tough but fair. But not everyone agreed with that statement, particularly if you were black, impoverished, or daring to speak up in his. He had a lengthy history of interrupting defense lawyers in court, particularly young ones. He would cut off witnesses in the middle of their sentences, and he was particularly effective at doing so in cases involving black defendants. Let's just say that the numbers weren't in favor of justice, and today's case was no different. Janitor Thomas, a young black man, was placed at the defense table. He was 22 years old, arrested for reportedly beating the store clerk and stealing a watch from a downtown jewelry store. But the CCTV tape was hazy, and the eyewitness had twice altered her account. The cashier was a friend of the... As the case file was passed around the courtroom, the air felt dense, as if the truth was wanting to speak, but was being held back. The judge's golf pal was still present, and the prosecutors had been pushing for 5 years. Carter was interrupted, skimmed the room, checked his spectacles, and then stared at Jay and Mr. Thomas. He added, "This court doesn't take kindly to criminals who think they can play games with the system, no," in a tone as sharp as a dagger. Jayan sat rigidly with his hands folded in his lap, his attorney Marcus Reed announcing that there was no presumption of innocence and that the judgment was rendered without mercy. Rosa had positioned herself close to the corner mop bucket with her rag in hand, and the young public defender, fresh out of law school, appeared obviously anxious. She moved slowly and deliberately, as if she knew how to blend in with the background. She washed a window here and a bench there, but she never took her eyes off Carter. Her attention was fixed on him, and she could see that he leaned forward when the prosecutor talked. She scribbled a fast note in her little notepad, which was concealed under her cleaning cart, as she watched Marcus's face tighten at every phrase he used to defend himself. Carter gave her a quick glance. However, he didn't really view her as a threat, like most people do, just another unseen person doing background work, and Rosa encouraged him to believe that as the prosecution presented the alleged proof, Rosa's attention, she consistently pointed out the contradictions, including the witness's hesitation and Carter's dismissal of the defense's objections with a sweep of his hand, as if he had already made up his mind deep inside Rosa's chest. Rosa wasn't there to cheer. Rather, she was there to alter the script during a brief break. Tightened, this wasn't really a courtroom. It was a theater, and the conclusion had already been written. Rosa had taken her mop cart down the hallway that led to the judge's chambers, where the tile floor was scratched and the air had a subtle scent of lemon and old wood, and she now found herself standing in a quiet hallway behind the courthouse. As she was polishing an obstinate spot off the baseboard, she heard two men speaking. One of them was clearly Judge Carr and the casual. "They think they can walk in here and cry race and get away with it," he added with a dry laugh, expressing the assurance of someone who has forgotten they may be overheard. "In my day, they wouldn't dare respond to a judge." The second voice was that of a man Rosa had known from earlier that morning. Henry Blake, the district attorney. He laughed and said, "Well, James, your courtroom still operates like it used to. Thank you, but don't let politics cloud your judgment." "Damn right," Carter said, "especially when some snarky public defender wants to waste my time defending that kid who was trashed on the street. He has the same attitude and lies as the previous one." And Rosa froze the cloth in her palm. There, it was not bias, supposition, or innuendo. She didn't move or breathe, she just listened. And Blake said, "If that caretaker lady out there is out there, this is raw, unadulterated contempt dressed in fine language, delivered with comfort and pride." Carter scoffed. "Heard us, we'd be in trouble. She probably doesn't even comprehend what we're saying, so she probably won't tell anyone." There was a long pause then. When Carter left his office, Rosa had just resumed wiping the wall in an attempt to appear preoccupied, but it was too late. His eyes narrowed as they met hers. Rosa turned to face him, her look placid. "Simply cleaning, sir." But she didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes met his and she held Carter. "How long have you been standing there?" he questioned in a cold, hard voice, moved closer and lowered his voice, saying, "Let me clarify what you believe you heard. You didn't, and you'll regret opening your mouth to anyone about anything." His remarks were low and poisonous. "You believe that people in this building care about you, but you don't. You're invisible. Stay in your lane." The corridor was still empty, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly. Rosa remained silent for a while before continuing to look at him without averting her gaze. She straightened up, folded her cleaning cloth slowly, and put it neatly on top of her cart. Her voice was quiet, but it contained steel. "That's odd about people you label invisible. Judges have a tendency to notice everything. So when Carter blinked once, it was insufficient for most people to notice. But Rosa saw that she picked up the handle of her mop and turned away without saying anything more, pushing her cart down the corridor as though nothing had occurred. But everything had changed because Rosa was now certain that what she had come here to find was the man behind the seat, and that it wasn't just a rumor or hunch. Not only was he biased, but he was also dangerous. As the trial's next phase approached, Carter returned calmly from the side door a little while later. But Rosa kept a close eye on him. His smile was a bit too forced, and his stride was a little stiffer. He had finally seen her, and for the first time in a long time, that made him. Later that afternoon, when the courtroom was starting to empty for lunch after hours of back-and-forth testimony, Rosa moved silently around the aisles, cleaning the wooden benches where the spectators had sat. She arrived at the front of the room close to the judge's bench and hurriedly looked around to make sure no one was watching from her side pocket. An hour before, the echoes of intense debates still appeared to linger in the air. She took out a little, worn leather-bound notebook from the cleaning cart. It was plain and black, with wrinkles around the spine and a tiny elastic strap to keep it tight. It appeared to be something a cleaner might bring too. Write down supply lists or cleaning schedules, but therein were names, dates, patterns, notes on rulings, behavior, and tone observations that she had accumulated over several weeks. No one wanted to acknowledge the existence of the patterns Rosa had been following for years, not only about this courthouse, but also about others like it, judges like Carter. She opened to a blank page and started writing rapidly, almost rhythmically, her pen moving across the page with practiced ease. She was halfway through a sentence when she felt a shadow fall across the bench. She didn't immediately look up, but she didn't have. Judge Carter Rosa looked up, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, peering down and out at her with the same mix of power. She could feel the tea in the air change. "What are you writing?" The voice was sharp and cold, and distrust he kept for those he saw as inferior. She gently and gradually closed the notebook, leaving only a few private notes, sir. Her voice was steady and courteous, but her eyes were. Carter's calm, analytical eyes never faltered as he squinted and took notes about your mop technique. His face remained stern, but there was a glimmer of laughter in his voice. Carter went closer, and Rosa briefly noticed the flash of anxiety behind his eyes as he smiled slightly and said, "There is nothing that would interest you, Your Honor." His response was too slick and swift. There was a lengthy moment between them before he remarked, "Vo dropping, you're here to clean. So do that. Don't worry, not yet, but this is the beginning of it." Rosa gently put the notebook back in her pocket, folded her rag over the side of her cart, and faced him directly. "Of course, sir, I know my role something." The room was empty, but the stillness sounded loud. He didn't know why, but something in her tone made him wince. He straightened his stance and repositioned himself as the persona of power. "Keep in mind that he said, tongue-clipped, this is my." "You don't want to cause yourself any trouble in the trial," Rosa said. She didn't have to answer, and her silence was more powerful than any threat. Without saying anything more, she turned and moved her cart in the direction of the corridor. For the first time, Carter realized something he hadn't thought of before, as he watched her leave with his jaw slightly clenched and his eyes fixed too intently on the pocket where the notepad had vanished. Rosa stopped outside in the hallway near the vending machines, opened her notebook again, and made a little line next to him while she watched him, and whatever she was writing in that little black book wasn't about cleaning supplies. the name James Carter, and placed a fresh note underneath it. It was confrontational, defensive, and showed early signs of panic. She put the notebook back in her cart and left, walking away slowly, calmly, and imperceptibly. But in her mind, the Rosa Ellis was no longer merely observing. She was constructing her own case. And the courthouse break room was never just about the young guy on trial. It was about something far broader today. Rosa stood by as the coffee maker sputtered in the corner, filling the air with the bitter fragrance of something brewed for too long, and fluorescent lights buzzed over faded linoleum, which felt especially warm today, but felt colder than usual. Anna Jenkins, who had been the senior clerk for almost 30 years, was cleaning her hands methodically in the wash basin when she strolled in, gripping her usual cracked mug a little tighter than usual. She was the type of lady who had been accustomed to suppressing her anger without expressing it, but today it showed in the way her jaws clenched and the way she swirled her coffee as if something had happened. Rosa didn't respond immediately away. Instead, she continued to dry her hands and folded the towel neatly. Anna murmured something about the judge about how he had ended the defense that morning without even seeming to listen, and put it back in the trash, then said, almost silently, as though talking to herself, "There are times when the law is loud, but justice whispers." Anna looked up, perplexed. Rosa smiled slightly but said, "The problem about Rosa is that she didn't say much, but when she did, it was enough to make Anna stop long enough to sow the seed of interest she hadn't anticipated feeling." "Stuck with you." A little later, Rosa ran into Marcus Reed, the young public defender, in the hallway outside the courtroom. He appeared to have been up all day with papers in his hand and ties that were a bit loose. He walked past Rosa without saying anything, but he stopped and looked at her for a moment. Something about the way she stood leaning against her mop handle with quiet confidence caused him to talk briefly about the case because it seemed like everything was against him. Rosa listened, not with empathy, but with a deeper understanding, as if she knew too much to just nod. Then, without thinking, she offered her tone was informal, almost dismissive, as though she were just discussing the weather. Marcus blinked, caught off guard, but before he could ask, she made a single remark regarding a federal rule that is rarely referenced in instances like this. Rosa pushed her cart ahead of anything else, vanishing into the passageways like a shadow that had. I had never been there as the building started to quiet down in the late afternoon. Though it was mild, Anna couldn't quit thinking about those two encounters. Justice whispers. Marcus subsequently, almost by chance, found himself going through his notes about that sentence, entered Rosa's cited ruling into his search box, and there it was, exactly as she had stated, neither of. They both knew Ross Ellis's true identity, but they started to think that she wasn't there merely to clean, someplace deep. The wind had begun to change slightly inside that peaceful courthouse with its ancient walls and customs. Yet, nevertheless, the courthouse floor was illuminated by the afternoon sun in long slants, capturing dust particles that. Courtroom 3B was silent except for the slow dance in the motionless air. The distant ticking of the wall clock and the sporadic shuffling of papers created a type of silence that didn't arrive. Jalen Thomas, seated at the defense table, had tight eyes and shoulders from calm yet pressure. Looked down, his borrowed, slightly big suit jacket hung rigidly on his posture. It seemed as though he was preparing for collision each time he looked up. Marcus Reed was standing behind them. Podium flinched under fire despite his best efforts, which all pointed to the testimony's contradictions, sparked concerns about the dearth of forensic evidence, and even brought attention to the surveillance film showed a figure that was obviously not Jalen's height or build, but it didn't seem to matter. Judge Carter cut Marcus and slouched a little in his chair, appearing uninterested and occasionally annoyed. Stopped in the middle of their sentence, raised objections before they were even done, and only leaned forward when the prosecution spoke from the bench as though they were the only voices worth listening to, and his words fell like stones. "If you're a counselor," Marcus swallowed hard, "and your plan is to squander the court's time," his mouth tightened, but he remained silent since he knew better than to push "not here." Even the few individuals in the courtroom felt a wave of silent discouragement as a result of this judge. Galleries primarily family members, but a few community advocates started to notice. Rosa stood in the background, undetected as usual, the shape of the result already taking shape like a storm cloud over them. Her mop lay against the wall in the corner close to the exit, forgotten that she was no longer feigning to clean her eyes. Remained resolute and focused on the judge, not out of disobedience, but even in judgment, but in a completely silent evaluation, similar to someone observing a machine break down slowly. Her hands were steady and her posture was firm as she waited for the right moment to step in. However, something had changed. This was now a decision rather than merely an observation. Carter looked to Jalen. There was a note of finality in his words, as if he were getting ready. He talked without asking in order to bring down the gavel, if not physically, then at least symbolically. But to tell them to declare instead of question, and Rosa was aware that she knew long before Jalen entered the room, the verdict was already written in the silent looks. Judge Carter had already selected justice, and his dismissive tone and refusal to take into account information that contradicted the story. Rosa Ellis had had enough and cautiously reached for her cart, but it wasn't being served, it was being staged. For a mop, but for something else, entirely more potent than bleach and rags, she decided the following. Move would be hers. The courtroom atmosphere had become so dense and oppressive that it felt like it was pressing down on each shoulder. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen slowly against the wood in the room, his eyes half lit. Based on the testimonies with the evidence at hand, he started, "This court is ready to go," and then a clear, calm voice. "Unmistakably, Your Honor, I have something to say." The room didn't need to turn as the words didn't yell. Rosa Ellis moved forward towards the rear, not hurriedly or hesitantly, but with the peaceful assurance of someone who has. Left her mop behind and put her cleaning gloves in her cart, which she no longer wore as she came to terms with the weight of truth. Carter looked at her in the invisibility outfit, momentarily perplexed. He sneered at you and said, "What could you possibly have to do?" to the caretaker. He left the words hanging like a slap, but Rosa didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned out and said, "That matters in a court of law." Grabbed a leather badge holder out of her coat pocket and silently flipped it out, revealing the rooms. The United States Supreme Court was clearly marked by the breath seal, and the hush broke. Like ice under a boot, the courtroom was filled with gasps that spread like wildfire. The BI blinked, seemingly unsure of whether to advance or retreat. Name is Rosa Ellis, and she spoke in a firm yet firm voice, "Associate Justice Ive. I came here undercover at the Department of Justice's request after serving on the U.S. Supreme Court for 13 years. Of justice after several civil rights allegations connected to this courtroom and this." Judge Carter's lips opened, but he remained silent. Rosa took another. Abruptly, her voice suddenly slicing through the space like a blade. "Over the previous few weeks, I've noticed a recurring pattern of prejudice, misuse of power, and disrespect for due process. What I've witnessed here today only serves to reinforce it, particularly when it includes defendants of color." She carefully looked around the room. The quiet woman with the mop was no longer there. Instead, she was the center of attention. For the first time in that courtroom, Carter gazed at someone who carried the very weight of justice in her palm. Tiny not due to his size, but rather because the truth had at last come to light. And Rosa was unquestionably in the room, yet it wasn't loud or furious. Held motionless by a force greater than shock, Rosa Ellis's self-disclosure wasn't the only thing that. She stood in the middle, representing truth as it emerged from the shadows. Of courtroom 3B, her unwavering and clear voice allowed the record to demonstrate that she started by saying that Judge James Carter had over. Throughout several cases, there was persistent judicial misconduct in the form of racial bias, disrespect for prior rulings, and intentional suppression of the defense counsel. Just the facts, without any drama or theatrics. She opened a tiny folder in her hands, marking and color-coding each page. Eyes searching with ease, as if they had been in the law for decades, not above it, not beyond it, but inside it. Judge Carter has presided over 27 felony cases in the last 6 months alone, including He decided in favor of the prosecution in 26 of those cases involving Black or Latino defendants, even when there was evidence. Either inadequate or incongruous, a whisper echoed across the courtroom like a ripple on glass, and Carter moved in. He added firmly, "You're cherry-picking, but Rosa," with a profound scowl sweeping across his face. "Did you not wince?" "It's documentation, not a biased assessment," she added. Her voice became quieter. "I've read your rulings and the objections were rejected without a valid reason." Short arguments. "I've seen your body language, including how you lean forward when the prosecution talks and how you—" It's not an accident that Carter interrupted a young defense attorney who was trying to be heard. It's a habit. He barking was a political ambush that was set up by liberals. He is defensive. Even the court reporter was stiffened by watchdogs and race hustlers who seek to compromise the integrity of this court. Hesitated, uncertain whether to continue typing, Rosa remained calm and carefully closed the folder and gave him a look that was considerably more menacing to a guy than rage. "James, Carter is positive that this isn't politics but rather accountability, and it's—" Long late, she turned to the clerk's table and placed her comments, which cut through the courtroom like crisp steel. Effective immediately, the folder containing the formal, calm, and purposeful report will be delivered to the Judicial Oversight Committee. I'm asking for an urgent review of every decision that Judge Carter has made in the last 12 months. Carter's face went pale. He sat down again, breathing heavily, as if the environment had lost its. Rosa added that a retroactive audit will be carried out on every case you've presided over in the past 5 years, including jury selections, sentencing decisions, and evidence suppression. You've been working in the shadows long enough that he didn't answer. Rosa hesitated, her eyes turned not towards Jalen, the young man who was still sitting at the defense table, quietly waiting for his eyes, but now towards Carter. Rosa let her breath settle, which is why she came, and they were both quite perplexed yet optimistic. For him and the hundreds of others who never had a voice loud enough, not for the press or the applause, the weight of decades rested on her as she stared back at the courtroom, strong enough to rise over a gavel. Shoulders, but she didn't mind wearing it because, once the truth is said, it never really leaves her, and today. The courtroom was still in disbelief once the words were finally spoken, but Judge Carter had been silently removed from the bench seconds before, his robe dangling slightly off one. His feet were uncertain, like a guy descending a precipice he never thought was real since the gavel had not fallen there. Justice occasionally moves Marcus Reed, stood without shouting so there wasn't a final B. Next to Jay and Thomas, who still appeared to be having trouble breathing, his lips moved but no words yet emerged. The clerk's voice was quivering a little from the excitement in the room as she read the new verdict aloud. Case dismissed, accusations dropped. The defendant is free to leave. For a little moment, there was only silence, and then people started to rise subtly, not in joy, but with a sense of comfort and acknowledgement that comes with no applause, but rather with heads nodding and hands nodding. Touched hearts. Jalen turned to Rosa, his eyes moist, and his attitude conveyed it without having to utter, "Thank you." She gave him a slight nod as though to convey that you were never invisible to me, and then Rosa. She turned, grabbed her coat, slung it over her arm, and headed for the door. The mop cart was gently and painstakingly moved out of the corner. As she passed, those in need moved aside. Not because they were ordered to, but because they desired to follow her with their eyes, not only out of reverence, but also with a deeper comprehension of the kind that only emerges after seeing reality in action, not just on paper, as she. Arrived at the doorway, someone whispered, "Ma'am, do you have anything to say?" From the gallery. Rosa hesitated, then turned. One last time, Justice's quiet was broken by her steady, solid voice. Cannot endure a situation in which the person holding the scale is dominated by prejudice. The truth must prevail, no matter how long it takes. The sun always finds its way to the light, and then she stepped outdoors into the crisp sunlight. Rosa stopped at the top, inhaling, as it started to drop low, leaving long golden streaks across the courtroom stairs. She didn't look back, not as a victor, but more as someone who had just completed the necessary task because some. If this tale touched you, remember that moments don't require introspection. They simply need to be lived and remembered. Your support means the world to us, so please give it a thumbs up and forward it to someone who needs to hear it. Keeps our staff motivated to produce more impactful and significant stories like this one. Please remember to hit the subscribe button. We appreciate you listening, and we're delighted you're here. You never miss the next installment.